The darkness of Guadalcanal was not simply an absence of light, but a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of humidity and rot that pressed against the lungs of every man in the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines. It was late October in the year 1942, and the jungle of the Solomon Islands had long since ceased to be just a terrain feature. It had become a hostile entity, a third combatant in a war that had stripped the veneer of civilization from young Americans and hardened Imperial Japanese soldiers alike. For Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Page, the night of October 26th was not merely another shift in the muddy foxholes along the ridge that shielded Henderson Field. It was the precipice of an abyss that had been widening for days. The air was thick with the cloying scent of decaying vegetation and the metallic tang of oiled steel, a sensory mixture that every Marine on the line had come to associate with imminent violence. They were tired, malnourished, and riddled with malaria, their bodies wasting away under the tropical sun, and their nerves frayed by the incessant nightly harassment of an enemy who seemed to possess the jungle itself. The ridge they occupied was a narrow spine of earth, a fragile dam holding back a reservoir of the Imperial Japanese Army's Sendai Division. Thousands of men who had marched through miles of trackless rainforest with a singular, fanatical purpose to push the Americans into the sea. Silence in the Pacific Theater was rarely a comfort. It was usually a prelude. And on this night, the silence was broken, not by the crack of a rifle, but by something far more insidious, a psychological weapon designed to shatter the resolve of the defenders before the first grenade was even thrown. From the black void of the jungle canopy below, their position voices began to drift up toward the Marine lines, disembodied and mocking, carrying over the rustle of the tall kunai grass, like ghosts haunting a graveyard. They spoke in a broken, jagged English that had been learned specifically for this moment, phrases designed to reach into the deepest insecurities of the exhausted teenagers shivering in their fighting holes. "Marine, you die tonight," the voices called out the words, distorted by distance and the thick air. The taunts were followed by laughter, a manic, high-pitched sound that scraped against raw nerves and made the skin crawl, a sound that suggested the enemy was not only confident, but delighted by the prospect of the coming slaughter. They screamed that the Americans would never see the sun rise, that their graves were already dug, and that the Emperor's vengeance was inevitable. It was a tactic as old as warfare itself, the attempt to convince the enemy that they were already dead, that resistance was futile, and that the darkness belonged to the hunters, not the prey. For the young Marines gripping their Springfields and Thompson submachine guns, the psychological assault was terrifyingly effective. Planting seeds of doubt in minds already clouded by exhaustion, but for Sergeant Mitchell Page, the screaming was not a source of fear, but a source of cold, calculating clarity. Page was a career Marine, a man who had not been drafted into this conflict, but had been forged by the Corps long before the world caught fire. He did not hear the jeering of monsters in the dark. He heard the desperate posturing of men who needed to scream because they were afraid of the silence. He lay behind the breech of his Browning M19-1 water-cooled machine gun, a heavy industrial beast of a weapon that was the anchor of his section's defense. To Page, the voices were merely target indicators, auditory cues that told him the enemy was massing, that they were close, and that they were arrogant. He ran his hand over the water jacket of the gun, feeling the cool metal checking the feed belt for the 100th time that hour, ensuring that the brass cartridges were seated perfectly in the cloth loops. While the Japanese soldiers shouted their insults, Page was engaging in a silent technical ritual, a heresy against the chaotic nature of war, where he imposed order through the mechanical perfection of his weapon system. The position Page held was critical. A saddle in the ridgeline that offered a direct route to the airfield, the prize that would determine the fate of the entire campaign in the Solomons. If the Japanese broke through here, the fragile toehold the United States held in the Pacific would be severed, the supply lines cut, and thousands of Marines would be slaughtered on the beaches. Page understood the geometry of the battlefield better than anyone else on that hill. He knew the interlocking fields of fire, the dead zones where the shadows were deepest, and the specific limitations of the 4 machine guns under his command. He moved from foxhole to foxhole in a crouch, his silhouette barely visible against the starless sky, checking on his men, whispering instructions that cut through the noise of the Japanese taunts. He told them to hold their fire, to wait until they could see the whites of their eyes, to let the enemy come into the kill zone before unleashing the fury of the guns. He was the calm center of a brewing storm, a man who had replaced fear with a professional obsession with ballistics and rates of fire. The mockery from the jungle grew louder, the chanting more rhythmic, sounding like a dark liturgy rising from the depths of hell. But Page simply settled back behind his gun, adjusted the traverse and elevation mechanism, and waited for the screaming to stop, because he knew that when the voices died away, the killing would begin. The transition from psychological warfare to kinetic assault happened in a heartbeat, a sudden shift that shattered the night as the jungle floor erupted with the muzzle flashes of thousands of Arisaka rifles and Nambu light machine guns. The first wave of the Sendai Regiment hit the Marine line with the force of a tidal wave, a screaming mass of humanity that surged up the slopes of the ridge with bayonets fixed and banners waving. The darkness was instantly banished by the strobe light effect of explosions and tracers, turning the ridge into a flickering nightmare of strobing violence where men lived and died in fractions of a second. Page did not hesitate. He racked the charging handle of his Browning twice and depressed the butterfly trigger, sending a stream of .30 caliber agony plunging into the darkness. The heavy machine gun roared a rhythmic thumping cadence that sounded like a jackhammer tearing up pavement, the belt devouring ammunition as the water in the cooling jacket began to boil. He swept the beaten zone back and forth, cutting scythe-like paths through the tall grass, watching as shadows crumpled and fell, only to be replaced instantly by more shapes emerging from the tree line. The attack was relentless, a human wave tactic that relied on overwhelming numbers to smother the defenders, and for a moment, it seemed as though the sheer weight of the Japanese assault would sweep the platoon away into oblivion. The heresy of Mitchell Page was his refusal to accept the mathematical impossibility of his situation. By all conventional military logic, his position was untenable. He was outnumbered perhaps 30-1, his flanks were exposed, and the enemy had the momentum of a freight train. Yet he treated the battle not as a desperate last stand, but as a problem of engineering and logistics. As the barrel of his gun grew hot enough to glow a dull red in the darkness, Page became a machine himself, his movements economical and precise. When a belt ran dry, he reloaded with fluid, practiced motions, ignoring the bullets that snapped past his head like angry hornets, and the mortar rounds that churned the earth around his foxhole into a slurry of mud and shrapnel. He could hear the screams of his own men, now the terrifying cries of Marines being overrun in the foxholes to his left and right, the wet thud of bayonets finding flesh, and the chaotic scrambling of hand-to-hand combat. The Japanese had breached the perimeter, pouring through the gaps in the line like floodwater through a cracked levee, and the orderly defense began to disintegrate into a series of isolated, desperate brawls in the mud. One by one, the other machine guns in his section fell silent. The crews were dead or wounded, their weapons jammed or destroyed by grenades, leaving gaping holes in the wall of fire that protected the ridge. Page realized with a cold, sinking sensation that the volume of fire returning from the Marine lines was dwindling rapidly, leaving his own gun as one of the few remaining focal points of resistance. The enemy realized it too. The tracers from the Japanese light machine guns began to converge on his muzzle, flash a cone of green fire, seeking to extinguish the one stubborn flame that refused to go out. He could feel the impacts of the rounds, striking the dirt berm in front of him, spraying his face with grit and pulverized rock, but he kept the trigger depressed, walking his fire into the thickest clusters of the enemy. He was shouting now, not in fear, but in a strange battle. Drunk fury screaming orders to men who could no longer hear him calling for ammunition, calling for the line to hold. The water in his jacket steamed violently, a hiss that was almost lost in the cacophony of the battle, and he knew that the weapon was pushing past its mechanical limits, just as he was pushing past his human ones. In the confusion, a Japanese officer led a squad of soldiers through the tall grass, flanking Page's position and getting within yards of the gun pit before they were spotted. They were close enough that Page could see the sweat glistening on their faces in the flashes of the grenades, close enough to see the fanaticism in their eyes as they prepared to rush him. His support crew was gone, killed, or incapacitated, leaving him alone to manipulate the heavy weapon. With a roar of exertion, he physically lifted the rear of the tripod, swinging the heavy gun around with brute strength that defied the laws of leverage, bringing the muzzle to bear on the flankers just as they rose to charge. The Browning bucked against his shoulder, spitting flame, and at point-blank range, the .30 caliber rounds tore through the attackers with devastating power, shredding the squad in a spray of mist and debris. He didn't have time to process the horror of it. He simply swung the gun back to the front, searching for the next target, his mind locked in a loop of acquire, fire, reload, survive. But the gun was failing. The intense heat had warped the metal, or perhaps the dirt and grime of the foxhole had finally fouled the mechanism. It jammed. The sudden silence from his weapon was louder than the explosions around him. He racked the bolt, kicked the receiver, cursed the god of war, but the gun was dead. To his left, he saw the silhouette of another Marine machine gun position, the crew slumped over the weapon, silent and still. Without a second of hesitation, Mitchell Page abandoned the safety of his foxhole and climbed out into the open, exposing himself to the storm of lead that filled the air. He ran through the mud, slipping and stumbling, bullets tearing at his dungarees, sprinting toward the dead gun. He dove into the neighboring foxhole, landing on top of the bodies of his fallen comrades, his hands immediately searching the weapon in the dark. It was a chaotic, gore-filled inspection. His fingers slick with blood, and oil, checking the feed tray, checking the bolt. This gun was hot, but it was functional. He spun the new weapon around, bringing it into the fight, just as a new wave of Japanese infantry crested the ridge, thinking they had finally silenced the American resistance. Page opened fire, the sudden resurrection of the machine gun, catching the enemy completely off guard. He cut them down in rows, piling bodies in front of the position, until they formed a grisly rampart that actually provided him with more cover. He was a ghost, a demon that moved from gun to gun, refusing to die, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. When that gun ran low on ammunition, he moved again, sprinting through the darkness to a third position, gathering belts of ammunition from the dead and wounded, draping them over his shoulders like bandoliers. He was entirely alone now, the last conscious man in the section, facing an entire regiment that was fixated on his destruction. The mockery from earlier in the night was gone, replaced by furious commands in Japanese, the enemy commanders directing all their firepower onto the lone Marine who stood between them and victory. The isolation was total. There was no radio contact, no reinforcements, no comforting voice of a commanding officer telling him to fall back. There was only Mitchell Page and the endless belt of ammunition feeding into the receiver. He had entered a state of existence where time had no meaning, where the past and future had dissolved, leaving only the immediate, brutal present. He was bleeding, though he didn't know from where. His hands were blistered and burned from handling the red-hot barrels of the machine guns. His ears were ringing with a deafness that would likely never fully fade. Yet in this absolute solitude, facing the heresy of a one-man war against an empire, Page found a reserve of strength that was not born of courage, but of a profound, incandescent rage. They had laughed at his Marines. They had mocked his brothers in the dark. Now he would make them pay for every syllable of that laughter with blood. He fired until the barrel glowed white, until the water boiled away completely, until the gun threatened to melt into a slag of useless iron. And when he sensed the enemy massing for a final, overwhelming rush that no single machine gun could stop, Mitchell Page did the unthinkable. He stopped firing. He waited in the darkness, letting the silence stretch out, baiting the trap. He knew they were there, crawling through the grass, inching forward, believing that finally the American demon was dead or out of ammunition. He let them get close, so close he could hear their breathing, hear the click of their equipment. Then he didn't reach for the trigger. He reached for the release latch on the tripod. In a feat of adrenaline-fueled strength that would become legend, he detached the 30-pound gun from its mount, wrapping the searing hot barrel in his jacket to protect his hands. He stood up. He did not crouch in the mud. He stood up to his full height, holding the heavy machine gun at his hip like a movie gangster with a Tommy gun, the heavy belt of ammunition trailing over his arm. He stepped out of the foxhole and onto the open ground of the ridge, a solitary figure illuminated by the dying flares. He screamed into the darkness, a primal roar that answered the taunts from hours before, and he charged. He charged the entire Japanese regiment alone, walking forward into the teeth of the enemy, the machine gun bucking against his hip, spraying a fan of fire that swept the ridge clear. The Japanese soldiers, expecting a cowering survivor, froze in shock at the sight of this lone maniac, advancing on them. Firing a crew, served weapon from the hip, walking through the firestorm as if he were immortal. Mitchell Page had ceased to be a sergeant. He had become the avatar of the Marine Corps, an unstoppable force of nature that turned the tide of the battle simply by refusing to accept that he was beaten. And as he walked forward, stepping over the dead firing burst after burst into the retreating shadows, the laughter in the jungle was silenced forever. The act of lifting a Browning model 1917 machine gun from its tripod and wielding it as a personal weapon was a violation of every tactical manual ever written by the United States Marine Corps. The weapon weighed over 30 pounds on its own, not accounting for the belt of ammunition that snagged on the undergrowth or the scalding heat radiating from the water jacket, which had long since boiled dry. To the men of the 2nd Battalion, who were cowering in the brush watching their sergeant silhouetted against the strobe light flashes of mortar explosions, Mitchell Page looked less like a soldier and more like a mythological figure forged from the mud and blood of Guadalcanal. The crucible was no longer about holding the line. It was about the sheer impossible physical endurance required to become a mobile battery of destruction. The skin on Page's hands was searing, the heat penetrating the thin fabric of his dungaree jacket. He had wrapped around the barrel, but the pain was distant, filtered through a massive dump of adrenaline that turned his perception of the world into a tunnel of grayscale clarity. He could feel the recoil of the weapon, not in his shoulder, but in his entire skeletal structure, a rhythmic hammering that threatened to shake his teeth loose, yet he marched forward step by heavy step into the killing zone. As he advanced, the few remaining Marines in the sector, men who had been paralyzed by the ferocity of the Sendai Division's assault, began to stir. They had been resigned to death, waiting for the inevitable bayonet thrust in the dark, but seeing Page walk upright into the firestorm, sparked something primal in their exhausted brains. It was a catalyst, a shift from the paralysis of terror to the manic desperation of the offensive. Page screamed at them, his voice raw and cracking over the roar of battle, ordering them to fix bayonets, to get up to follow him into the abyss. He was creating a skirmish line out of the remnants of a shattered platoon, pulling riflemen out of their holes by the sheer force of his will. The crucible was this transition, the moment where a beaten unit decides to die on its feet rather than on its knees. A young private, shivering and weaponless, saw Page cut down 3 Japanese soldiers who were rushing the flank. The private grabbed a discarded rifle from a corpse, checked the bolt, and scrambled up the muddy embankment to join his sergeant. Another followed, then another, until a ragged, bleeding wedge of Marines formed behind the walking machine gun, their fear transmuted into a cold, lethal resolve. The weapon in Page's hands chugged with a rhythmic mechanical violence, spitting empty brass casings into the mud at his feet. He was firing from the hip, walking the stream of bullets back and forth across the ridge, suppressing the enemy heads that popped up from the kunai grass. The physical strain was immense. Every muscle in his back and arms was locked in a spasm of effort to keep the muzzle level. The belt of ammunition was a living thing, twisting and turning, feeding the hunger of the gun. When one belt ran dry, he didn't retreat to reload. He dropped to one knee, exposed to the enemy fire, and frantically threaded a new belt into the receiver. His movements jerky but precise, the muscle memory of thousands of drills taking over where his conscious mind had shut down. Bullets snapped the air around him, cutting through the grass, inches from his face, thumping into the wet earth. But he moved with the fatalistic immunity of a man who has already accepted his own death. He was the focal point of the battle, drawing the enemy's fire away from his vulnerable riflemen, making himself the biggest, loudest target on the ridge. The Japanese soldiers, trained in the Bushido code and believing in their spiritual superiority, were unprepared for this kind of aggression. They had expected the Americans to crumble under the night attack, to break under the pressure of the screaming charges. Instead, they were facing a demon who breathed fire, a single man who commanded the firepower of a platoon and refused to fall. The psychological impact of Page's charge began to fracture the cohesion of the Sendai Regiment. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the noise. Squads that were preparing to rush the American lines hesitated, pinned down by the relentless sweeping fire of the Browning. Page sensed this hesitation, a subtle shift in the tempo of the incoming fire, and he capitalized on it. He surged forward again, bellowing a war cry that was unintelligible, a sound of pure fury. His makeshift squad followed, firing their Garans and Thompsons, throwing grenades, screaming in response. The ridge, which had been a defensive position moments ago, became a slaughterhouse as the Marines counterattacked into the teeth of the invasion force. This was the beginning of the slaughter, the phase of the battle where tactics dissolved into butchery. The distance between the combatants closed to zero. Page led his men into the tall grass, where the Japanese were massing, and the engagement devolved into a series of vicious close-quarters duels. The heavy machine gun was too unwieldy for point-blank wrestling matches, so when a Japanese officer lunged at him with a samurai sword, screaming an ancestral oath, Page had to swing the hot barrel of the gun like a battering ram, smashing it into the attacker's chest, the heat of the metal searing flesh. He dropped the gun, drew his sidearm, and fired until the slide locked back, then grabbed the machine gun again, racking the bolt and continuing the devastation. The darkness was filled with the sounds of impacts, wet, crunching noises of rifle butts striking bone, the wet thud of bullets hitting soft tissue, the gurgling screams of dying men. It was a chaotic melee, where the only identification of friend or foe was the shape of the helmet silhouette against the stars. The terrain itself fought against them. The mud was ankle-deep, slick with blood, and rain making every step a gamble. vines and roots snagged at their boots, threatening to trip them into the path of enemy bayonets. But Page pressed the advantage, driving the wedge deeper into the Japanese formation. He was firing bursts so long that the barrel of the Browning was glowing a dull, angry cherry red in the dark, a beacon that terrified the enemy. The gun was destroying itself, the rifling in the barrel being stripped away by the friction of the copper-jacketed bullets. But it didn't matter. Accuracy was irrelevant at this range. Volume was everything. He sprayed the tree line. He sprayed the foxholes. He sprayed the shadows that moved. He was consuming the enemy regiment, chewing through their ranks, with an appetite for destruction that bordered on the industrial. The sheer amount of lead he was putting into the air created a wall of death that the Japanese could not penetrate. As the momentum shifted entirely to the Marines, the Japanese retreat began, not as an orderly withdrawal, but as a rout. They broke contact, turning and fleeing back down the slippery slopes of the ridge toward the jungle canopy. But Page did not let them go. He chased them. He ran to the forward edge of the ridge, dropped the heavy gun onto the wet earth, and continued to fire into the backs of the retreating soldiers. The slaughter was absolute. The ground in front of his position was carpeted with bodies, layers of fallen enemy soldiers that looked like uneven terrain in the gloom. The air was so thick with cordite smoke that it tasted like acid. Page's hearing was gone, blown out by the concussion of the muzzle blasts, leaving him in a silent world where he could only feel the recoil and see the muzzle flashes. He fired the last rounds in the belt, the bolt slamming home on an empty chamber with a metallic clack that signaled the end of the ammunition, but not the end of his rage. He grabbed a rifle from a wounded Marine next to him and continued to fire, emptying clip after clip of .30-06 ammunition into the dark tree line until the barrel of that weapon too began to smoke. He was possessed a man who had looked into the abyss and decided to fill it with the bodies of his enemies. It was only when the sky began to turn a bruised purple in the east, signaling the approach of dawn, that the shooting finally tapered off. The Japanese were gone, melted back into the jungle, leaving behind a regiment's worth of dead and the shattered remnants of their pride. Mitchell Page stood on the crest of the ridge, his chest heaving, his uniform shredded and soaked in blood that was not his own. He looked down at the machine gun that lay smoking in the mud, its water jacket dented, its paint blistered and peeling. It was a piece of machinery that had been pushed beyond its design limits, just like the man who had carried it. The transition to the ghost phase began with the light. As the sun crested the horizon, illuminating the battlefield of Guadalcanal, the true scale of the night's violence was revealed. It was a landscape of horror. The ridge was covered in hundreds of Japanese bodies, some piled 3 or 4 deep in front of the foxholes, where Page and his men had made their stand. The grass was matted down, stained a deep rust brown. The smell was the first thing that hit the survivors. As the adrenaline faded, the overwhelming sickly sweet stench of blood opened bowels and wet copper. Page sat down heavily on an ammo crate, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, uncontrollably covered in blisters from the hot metal ingrained with carbon and oil. He felt hollowed out, as if the spirit that had animated him during the night had departed, leaving behind a shell of a man who was incredibly old, despite his youth. General Alexander Vandegrift, the commander of the 1st Marine Division, came to the line later that morning to inspect the aftermath. He had heard reports of a breakthrough of a desperate counterattack, but the scene that greeted him stunned the hardened commander. He walked through the carnage, stepping over the enemy dead, until he found the position where the lone machine gunner had held the flank. He saw the empty ammo boxes scattered like confetti, the discarded rifles, the sheer physical evidence of the volume of fire that had been unleashed. When he found Page, the sergeant was cleaning his weapon, stripping the bolt assembly with slow, deliberate movements. The general asked him how he had done it, how one man had stopped a regiment. Page didn't have a poetic answer. He didn't speak of glory or patriotism. He simply said that he couldn't let them through. It was the answer of a craftsman who had finished a difficult job, the answer of a ghost who was still trying to find his way back to the land of the living. The citation for the Medal of Honor would use words like gallantry, intrepidity, and extraordinary heroism. It would describe how Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Page, while operating a machine gun section, continued to fight after all his men were killed or wounded. It would detail how he moved from gun to gun, how he carried the weapon into the assault, how he single-handedly broke the enemy attack. But the paper citation could never capture the smell of the burning gun oil, the sound of the Japanese chanting in the dark, or the feeling of the mud sucking at his boots as he walked into the fire. The medal was placed around his neck in a ceremony far removed from the blood and rot of the Solomons, a gleaming star suspended from a blue ribbon that represented the highest honor a nation could bestow. Yet for Page, the medal was a heavy weight. It was a tangible reminder of the empty foxholes of the friends who didn't come back, of the faces of the men he had killed in the intimacy of the dark. After the war, Mitchell Page became a symbol, a living legend of the Marine Corps. He walked in parades, he gave speeches, he shook hands with presidents and generals. But there was always a part of him that remained on that ridge in 1942. He carried the ghost of the battle with him, a shadow that stood just behind his shoulder. He lived a life of quiet dignity, refusing to capitalize on his fame for personal gain. He worked to identify the unnamed faces in the photographs of the war, trying to ensure that the boys who died in the mud were not forgotten by history. He understood that the Medal of Honor did not belong to him alone. It belonged to the 33 men of his platoon who had held the line until they couldn't, to the thousands of Marines who had fought and died in the island-hopping campaign. He was merely the custodian of their memory, the one who had survived to tell the story. In his later years, Page would often be asked about that night. People wanted to know what he was thinking, what special training he had relied on. They wanted a secret, a key to understanding such superhuman courage. But Page would only smile, a sad, knowing smile. There was no secret. There was only the training, the weapon, and the brothers to his left and right. When the brothers were gone, there was only the duty to protect them, even in death. The darkness of Guadalcanal never truly left him. It was there in the quiet moments of the night, in the sudden startle at a loud noise, in the way he would look at a machine gun with a mixture of reverence and revulsion. He had charged a regiment alone and won, but the victory had cost him a piece of his soul that he would never get back. The legacy of Mitchell Page is not just in the history books or the citation of his medal. It is in the ethos of the Marine Corps itself. He proved that technology and numbers are secondary to the human will. He demonstrated that a single individual, refusing to yield to fear, refusing to accept the logic of defeat, can change the course of history. The Japanese soldiers, who had laughed in the dark, who had taunted the lonely Marine with promises of death, had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that the man in the foxhole was just another soldier. They did not know they were waking a giant, provoking a force that would consume them. In the end, the laughter stopped, and the only sound that remained was the heavy, rhythmic thumping of a water, cooled browning, echoing through the pages of history, a testament to the night when one man held the line against the empire of the sun. The abyss had stared into Mitchell Page, and Mitchell Page had stared back, and it was the abyss that blinked. The jungle reclaimed the ridge eventually. The kunai grass grew back, covering the scars in the earth and the rusted fragments of metal. The foxholes filled with rain and debris. The bones of the fallen were gathered and buried. but the memory of the stand remains. It is whispered in the recruit depots of Paris Island and San Diego, taught in the classrooms of Quantico. It is the story of the ultimate underdog, the man who was outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded, yet decided that he would simply not allow the enemy to pass. It is the story of the ghost of Guadalcanal, the man who walked through fire and emerged on the other side, carrying the weight of a nation's gratitude and the heavy, silent burden of survival. And as long as there are Marines, the name of Mitchell Page and the night of October 26th, 1942, will be spoken with a reverence reserved for the immortals of war.